Hola clase, feliz año nuevo. ¿Cómo estaban tus vacaciones? Espero que pases muy bien. Hoy vamos a aprender el imperfecto, el otro tiempo pasado. All right, guys. So today we're going to talk about something that Spanish has that English doesn't have. In English, we only have one past tense. So when we're talking about things that happened in the past, we only have one past tense to choose from. We say things like yesterday, I walked to the store, I grabbed a Coke, and I rode my bike home. And we use that one past tense to talk about all actions that we did in the past, no matter what type of actions they were. In Spanish, though, there are actually two past tenses. So we've already learned the preterite tense, which is the first past tense in Spanish. And today we're going to learn the imperfect tense, which is considered the second past tense in Spanish. And here's the thing. You can't just pick whichever tense you want and just use the imperfect tense or use the preterite tense whenever you want for any action that you're talking about. You have to choose the correct tense, all right? So just like picking whether you should use the present tense or the preterite tense or the future tense, you have to be able to pick between the two past tenses in Spanish. And while that can be a little bit tricky, we're going to study the differences between the two past tenses in Spanish a little bit at a time. And I think that you'll see that it's actually pretty manageable, all right? And so today, let me just talk about when we will use the imperfect tense. We'll talk about and review the preterite tense and when we use it a little bit later. Right now, really, the only thing you need to remember about the preterite tense is we use the preterite tense when we're talking about one-time completed past actions, all right? But with the imperfect tense, we're going to use it to describe past actions that were repeated, like they happened multiple different times, or we'll use it to talk about actions that were habitual, things that we did a lot just out of habit. Like every day, we always did the same thing. Like we woke up in the morning and we ate breakfast and our mom brought us to school. We'll also use the imperfect tense whenever we want to tell time in the past. So if I want to say yesterday, it was 3 o'clock, then I'm going to have to use the imperfect tense. Whenever we describe things in the past, we're going to want to use the imperfect tense. So if we're describing people or places or things, we're going to use the imperfect tense. Or if we're wanting to say things like, when I was a kid, I used to, whenever we want to use that phrase used to explain what life used to be like or to describe what life used to be like, we'll also use the imperfect tense. And then finally, for the most part, whenever we're talking about our emotions or our feelings, we're going to use the imperfect tense. And so if we're talking about how we felt the other day, or if we're talking about what we were thinking about the other day, we're more than likely going to use the imperfect tense to talk about those actions. Really, at the end of the day, we can summarize the imperfect tense like this: ongoing past actions, all right? Ongoing past actions. That's how I would summarize the imperfect tense. And like I said, the best way to summarize the preterite tense is one-time completed past actions, all right? And like I said, we'll talk about the differences a little bit more in the future. But for now, this is a good place to start. All right, so let's look at how we form the imperfect tense. For regular AR verbs, like hablar, we're going to use these endings. We're going to use aba, abas, aba, abamos, and aban, all right? So the AR verbs end up getting the nickname, the abas, because they all have that aba sound in all of their ending. And that will just help you remember them. So we have yo hablaba, tú hablabas, él, ella, usted hablaba, nosotros hablábamos, and ellos, ellas, ustedes hablaban. They're actually kind of fun to say, so you should try it. Forming regular ER and IR verbs are really easy as well because ER and IR verbs in the imperfect tense have the exact same endings. And so these get the nickname the IAs because you're going to see they all kind of have that same ia sound. So the endings are ia, ias, ia, iamos, and ian. And they're exactly the same for the verb vivir, for IR verbs. So we have yo comía, tú comías, él, ella, usted comía, nosotros comíamos, and ellos, ellas, ustedes comían. So then vivir would be vivía, vivías, vivía, vivíamos, and vivían. Because Spanish has two different past tenses, it's really important to be aware of some special clue words that you can be watching out for. So when you read a sentence that's talking about something that happened in the past, you can look for the clue words on this page here. And if you see one of these clue words, then you'll know that the imperfect tense is probably being used. Or if you're the one writing the sentence and you use one of these clue words in your sentence, then you'll also know that you should probably use the imperfect tense. There are a whole nother list of clue words for the preterite tense, and we'll be looking at those later when we really start comparing the imperfect tense and the preterite tense. Because keep in mind, you'll have to be writing sentences or essays and even telling stories in Spanish, and you'll have to use both of these tenses in different sentences, and sometimes you'll even be using both tenses in the exact same sentence. So these clue words are just a good starting point. We've got siempre, which is always, con frecuencia, which is often, frecuentemente, frequently, a veces, sometimes, muchas veces, many times, cada mes, each month, todos los días, every day, todos los años, every year, todas las semanas, every week, and cuando era un niño, or cuando era un niña, when I was a child. And you'll notice that all of these kind of have something in common. They're all setting the scene to be talking about an action that happened a lot of times, okay? And so when you see these clue words, you'll go, oh, this is probably going to have the imperfect tense in it because we're talking about an action that was repeated or it was habitual and it happened a lot of different times. Ok, aquí tenemos algunos ejemplos. So, Alexandria, comer fruta cada día. So we're going to take the verb comer and we're going to conjugate it to match Alexandria. So it's like saying she. And when we read this, then we understand that this sentence is saying she eats fruit every day, because we see that cada, that's a clue word that's telling us that we should use the imperfect tense here, because this is an action that happened multiple times. It was repeated. If it just said Alexandria ate fruit yesterday for breakfast, then we would want to use the preterite tense, right? But you guys remember the preterite tense, right? Comió. We would use the preterite tense instead if we were saying that she did this one time yesterday for breakfast. But since we're implying that she did this every day, then we're going to use comía. So we would say she ate fruit every day. Todos los días tú caminar con tus amigos. So we're going to conjugate that. We're going to take off the AR and add abas. So caminabas. Todos los días tú caminabas con tus amigos. So every day or all of the days you walked with your friends. So again, when we see this clue word todos los días, we know that we should be using the imperfect tense because we're talking about an action that was repeated or habitual. If we just said that yesterday you walked with your friends to school, and if we were only talking about one specific time that you walked in the past, then we wouldn't use the imperfect tense, right? We would use the preterite tense. Next one, cuando era un niño, yo viajar a Panamá cada verano. So we're going to do viajaba for our conjugation. Yo viajaba a Panamá cada verano. When I was a child or when I was a boy, I traveled to Panama every year. And there's actually two clue words in here, cuando era un niño and cada. All right, so when I was a child is kind of setting the scene to say, hey, I'm going to tell you something that I did a lot or what life used to be like when I was a child. And then cada tells you that this was a repeated past action because every summer I traveled. It wasn't just one trip that I made to Panama. If I went to Panama last year for spring break for the first time, I would use the preterite tense to explain that action because it only happened once. Ellos escribir con frecuencia en la clase de inglés. So they write a lot or they write frequently in English class. So I'm going to conjugate that as escribían. All right. The next one, nosotros siempre correr los viernes. So that one, I take off the IR and I add íamos. So corríamos. Nosotros siempre corríamos los viernes. We always run Friday. Okay. Or we always ran Friday. It'd be past tense. And so again, we see that clue word siempre. So this is telling us that this was an ongoing past action. It was habitual. It was repeated. It happened a lot of different times. And so we use the imperfect tense here, not the preterite. We would use the preterite if I said, last Friday, I ran in the race with my friends. That would be implying that it only happened one time. We'll talk more about when we specifically use the preterite and imperfect tense later on, but this is at least a good start. Adios.